Hello and welcome to the after show. After a couple of days after the show, we are recording on Monday, the 9th of October, having had a little bit of time to reflect upon our most recent episode of Watching Brief, where we primarily discussed the fallout from the felling of the tree at Sycamore Gap on Hadrian's Wall. And I've just literally pressed record because we were having this conversation and we're at risk of having it without actually recording it, because Andy just came to a very interesting point about sort of lessons that could be drawn from this story and also not going too far from it for professional archaeologists. So, I mean, so do you think in the first instance that there is actually a story here, or a potential lesson here for our colleagues in the power of certain archaeological sites and news stories, and how far they can go in terms of furthering, I guess, the broad awareness and consciousness of the importance of archaeology?
Well, yeah, the point I was just making, and I tied it to the issue of the Crooked House pub demolition as well, which we touched on in the discussion, and obviously we've covered at length in the Watching Brief in the last 6 weeks or so since it happened. But I think both those stories and the reaction in the wider community to those stories, the sense of anger, of loss, of grief, in the what appears to be the inexplicable, even the wanton, destruction of much loved natural and heritage objects in the heritage environment. It's a lesson, I think, and it's a point I tried to make in the show, but I think it's, I'm very happy to make it again, because I think it's an important one potentially, and that is that archaeologists and heritage people really need to be aware of the power of some of these narratives that we deal with, and also being prepared to listen to people who aren't necessarily professionals but are engaging with these stories and are at an emotional level, and that's not always a bad thing. I think there's sometimes a sense in archaeology that we're scientific. Everything has to be empirical. Everything has to be based on evidence. And yeah, of course it does. But some of that evidence can actually be coming from left field. That, the community is really engaged with this particular site and is angry about it. You see it all the time in planning arguments. And it's interesting, we're talking on the day of the Shadow Chancellor's speech, Rachel Reeves, who's likely to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer within a year or so. And she's talking about, as the Conservative Party have been talking about, streamlining is the phrase that's always used, but planning, to make it easier to build in certain areas, and the one that's often quoted is the so-called green belt around some UK towns. They were established to limit building on the edge of large urban areas to prevent what's called urban sprawl. The idea that you just have a town spreading out into the countryside like a canker, and you'd end up with a completely built up area with no open spaces,
Conurbations, I believe,
literally no room to breathe. And yeah, but that's seen as a block on building necessary housing, and governments for years have been wrestling with that one. But people on the ground sometimes pejoratively are called NIMBYs, not in my backyards. And are seen, and that's seen as a sort of irrational and emotional response. But again, like I say, that's not always a bad thing. You can start from that point, and then you can find that you can work in from it and say, well, actually, yeah, that there are good, arguable, empirical reasons for taking that stance. Like, we need green spaces.
Well, we do, but I think that there are limitations, though, clearly. So, for example, during the episode, I suggested, and while editing it, I thought, is that hypocritical of me? But I suggested that we can't just have people planting trees, new sycamores in and around Sycamore Gap as some sort of almost like a memorial garden, or what would become a memorial forest or woodland, because we also need to be have stewardship of that landscape, and the tree being there on its own has happened over time. I think there originally were more trees there, but people decided
Yeah.
collectively to get rid of all but one. And so I suppose in that sense there has to be a limit, presumably, to the people and the and their past, this kind of thing, because we are educated to deal with and to understand the context of those stories as well. So and the thing is, I say this largely speaking, as you know, as someone who does believe that sometimes archaeologists are far too precious about controlling, in particular, a sense of authority. A few years ago, there was a particular archaeologist who has an interest in the implications of social media, who posited the problem. They were asking at conferences, well, how do we balance being on social media, being publicly accessible, with maintaining our intellectual authority? If any,
I remember that discussion.
yeah,
Yeah.
if anyone can
Yeah.
start up a Facebook page, if everyone's on a level playing field, then how on earth do we make sure that we're still on stilts? And I can't help but wonder whether that's the issue. That's the thing that sort of bothers me most, is that it's not about being on stilts. It has to be about making a good case for why you should be listened to, and the relationship between your work and people who live in the landscape that your work is about. I mean, I think you often talk about how archaeology sometimes appears to be something which is done to people. Archaeologists
Yeah.
are helicoptered in and they just do they do
Yeah.
archaeology. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do take the point of view, and particularly in developer-led archaeology, developer-funded archaeology,
Mm.
because that does come at the end of the planning system, often at the end of some quite intense discussions come rouse in
Mm.
communities,
Mm.
where often community groups feel steamrolled, and in
Mm.
fact feel we've talked about Old Oswestry a lot recently, and it's a story we've been covering for many years now, since the controversial development Old Oswestry Hill Fort
Mm-hmm.
was first proposed. And I remember, it's no secret that the local groups that were organising on part of the Hands Off Old Oswestry Hill Fort campaign, the WHO campaign, felt let down when Historic England basically compromised on, as they saw it, on the rules to allow that a development could take place
Mm.
in the
Mm.
setting of the Hill Fort. The reason for that is that Historic England has a government remit to support sustainable development, and it's very difficult for them to reach a point where they say no categorically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So these things are really, really nuanced, and archaeologists can find themselves, in some people's eyes, on the wrong side of the argument. We're seeing the same thing happen at Stonehenge.
Mm. Well, the thing is, we're seeing the same thing happen at Stonehenge also, though, it should be said, due to legitimate archaeological differences of opinion.
Yes.
But like, you won't say this, but I would probably say something along the lines of, some archaeologists see an opportunity to be one of the main faces of a project, for example, or to write a book about it, this kind of thing. Other archaeologists genuinely see it as an actual sampling strategy, the opportunity to go under the ground and take out a tube of earth and see what's there. So that there are legitimate questions back and forth, and I suppose the fear of demonstrating that publicly seems to be a fear of making it look as though archaeologists don't know what they're doing. And yet this is a broader. I think this is a broader scientific literacy question, because actually an awful lot of people out there say, "Oh, whoa! So now scientists think this is poisonous." Ugh, they didn't say that before. But that's the whole point of scientific emergent truth, is that it's subject to change. If it never changed, I don't know. There are very few things that survive and don't change in life, aren't there?
That's true, but I think particularly in places like Stonehenge, places that are tied to a very strong sense of place,
Hmm.
and are very emblematic. You put Stonehenge on an
Oh,
English tourism
sorry. Yeah,
poster,
yeah.
people
No,
know
no.
instantly what's going on.
Yeah, no. That's not an
And no, but the point
that's not an argument for changing the landscape, I should say. Yeah.
no,
No.
it isn't.
No. No.
No, the point I was going to make was that in terms of opposing changing that landscape by
Hmm.
building a tunnel and a dual carriageway, um, there are some elements of that campaign, and I must stress they're not endorsed by the leading campaigners
Hmm.
in the Stonehenge Alliance. But you go onto social media, and you find there is a strand of blood and soil nationalist opposition
Hmm.
to destroying the cradle of England and Englishness.
When
Um,
everyone knows the cradle of
and
Englishness was actually in the northeast of England, at places like Jarrow. Thank you very much.
exactly, because Englishness post dates Stonehenge by something like 3,000 years. Yeah,
Oh well,
right.
yeah, yeah, of course.
Um, and but anyway, the point is, I think there's a sense of, if these blood and soil fascist adjacent
Hmm.
voices are
Hmm.
on the side of the anti A303 upgrade bypass tunnel campaign, can we afford even to be seen to be on the same side as them? Because what the campaign has got is a difficult job of nuancing the the anti argument, but saying this isn't about blood and soil. It's about the environment. It's about net zero. It's about an outdated project design. It's about the
Yeah.
fact that it's being done on the cheap,
Well,
and so on and so on and so on.
it's conservation and environmental awareness as opposed to
Yeah,
conservatism, I suppose. And that's
that's one
putting
way
it
of putting it.
very
That's a good way.
very
Yeah,
gently. like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but yeah, it's not easy. But what I do suspect is that a lot of people who should be at the forefront of these conversations, for example, organisations that say they are the voice of archaeology, don't talk about it, and they don't talk about it for some reasons which I have awareness of and some sympathy for. So, for example, at the CBA, we've talked about, I think in episodes possibly, but certainly in our agendering, how there's a board of directors there, and you can only do so much against their will. And so, in that sense, it may well be that actually the organisation would like to be moving in a more open conversation way, but these things are slow to move, slow to turn.
I think also it's in archaeology, it's very much an issue of resources.
Yeah.
You look at the resources that are available to the National Trust and to the RSPB. They're much greater than are available to for example, the CBA.
Well, but
Although it's our sectors.
isn't this then where the irony comes in of needing more public interaction, more public support? And so the getting that balance right between more public support and not being so wholesale that the blood and soil types turn up um,
Yeah,
is a difficult
but
balance,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah, it is. But it's something that archaeologists wrestled with, certainly in my professional lifetime,
Hmm.
since the early 80s. And certainly when I was pivoting to archaeology qualifications and then working as an archaeologist and in archaeological education and latterly archaeological media,
Hmm.
um, since 1990. I remember, for example, when Time Team debuted,
Hmm.
it was controversial.
Hmm.
And I don't think it's any secret. In fact, it was written, I think it was in an article in British Archaeology. I think I saw this.
Hmm.
Anyway, but when it's recorded that when Time Team debuted, a very senior archaeologist and academic, a sort of household name, at least in the sector, for a particular set of for a particular line of work, is alleged to have said, we don't want to make archaeology too popular. People might want to get involved.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I've spent I've spent my entire lifetime learning how to do this. I don't want to be. The subtext was absolutely my entire lifetime. Learning how to do this. I don't want to be told what I should be doing by somebody who's watched a TV program.
Yeah. Well, actually, to be fair, that's probably the nicest way of analysing that. There are other ways. In so much as there's definitely a generation of archaeologists who it was a hobby. They had significant private income, and they could just get along in academia quite nicely. Thank you very much, with a pipe and slippers. And so we still have a hangover of that, definitely. The thing is, though, it's arguably metastasized into structures of access now, hasn't it? So again, I'm not going to say anything too controversial here, but if you look at the way that committees and other groups form around everything from local history groups all the way up to national professional bodies, there are blind spots, shall we say, and there is a tendency to presume that I mean, heck, if we step slightly to the side, in the National Trust, for example, they presume what your interests are going to be based on your postcode, and that data in terms of income, in terms of education, is now about 20, 30, going on 30 years old. So, for example, according to those postcodes, the postcode where I live, the estate that I live on, a 1940s housing estate in North Tyneside, I shouldn't give a monkeys about history. I should basically just be interested in pop music and reality TV. So some of that stuff gets baked into these institutions and organizations, and their best practice in terms of pursuing members of the public who they think will be interested in what they're doing sometimes leads them to be more exclusive. And so you have this weird sort of tension between exclusivity in terms of genuine access and talk of inclusivity. There's an awful lot of talk, and even whole conference sessions given to increasing cultural, ethnic, economic, class, and other forms of diversity, sexual orientation, etc., into archaeology. But again, the movement is very slow, quite possibly because of these slightly ossified, no pun intended, structures that do exist. And the thing is, I know sometimes in an episode, in watching brief episodes, I get quite angry about this. I get quite annoyed, and we'll sort of have a little rant. But in reality, I don't actually expect these things to change overnight. I just want to see genuine messaging and genuine attempts at moving towards the direction that people say that they want to move towards. If that makes sense.
I mean, just to sort of, I suppose, focus my thoughts in finishing. It's obviously these are short post shows, and we're sort of chewing the cud a bit. So just throwing out some ideas.
Interesting. I think it's been interesting.
Oh no, I'm not saying it's not. I mean, I hope that they're enjoyable and thought provoking for our viewer, as much as I we do a lot of back and forth, don't we, on watching brief and prepping watching brief, and it's a bit like the iceberg. What you see in the watching brief, there's a whole great big lump of prep and conversation underneath the surface that yes, you might not see, waiting to hold the passing ocean liner. But no, I mean, I'm comms are a bit fluid at the moment, and I'm just about to reconfigure my comms away from Twitter towards Blue Sky Social, and I'm also starting as an experiment Substack to carry the stuff that doesn't fit so well on the Pipeline website. And the piece I'm going to open that with, I'm still working on it, but bit of a sneak preview to our viewer. It's about archaeological comms, and it's about how we talk to people. And one of the thoughts I'm throwing out is that archaeology really needs to learn from what's happened in the medical profession in the last 20, 30 years, particularly since the rise of the internet, which is that it's no longer good enough to say doctor knows best, because a patient can go straight online and Google the conversation and find alternate views and maybe research that maybe their GP isn't aware of yet. It's a much more complex communication environment that we live in now, and the playing field is a lot more equal than it used to be.
Well,
Having said that, of course, there are also, as you know, we're fighting constantly against, fake archaeology, the Graham Hancocks of this world, who misrepresent evidence and so on.
There's lots of bad faith medical websites out there, but also it's also fair to say, in that sense, as you say, the medical profession has and is learning. So Mrs. Soup works at a hospital where she's constantly having to interface between the public and sometimes surgeons and consultants, and they're having to learn, as you would put it, to speak human, in order to have their decisions and their thinking understood such that they are trusted. Whereas previously they wouldn't have bothered to think that they needed to be trusted. They'd just be like, I am a surgeon.
Exactly. And I think it's important to stress as well. Yeah, and I think it's important to stress as well, questioning somebody, asking somebody to say, well, you say this, but why? That's not questioning their professionalism.
No.
That's not questioning their integrity. It's just saying, look, I'd actually just like to know.
Yeah. Yeah. And often because it's a matter of consent.
Yes. Very much so.
And that goes back to this notion of archaeologists doing archaeology to communities, doesn't it?
That's and that's a point I address in the piece as well. Yeah.
Well, folks, this has been an after show. I may ask the community if I can make this after show public, actually, just give people a sense of what they're missing out on if they're not supporting us on Patreon. But we shall see. At the very least, hopefully you guys enjoy this in the Soup Kitchen and on Patreon. I look forward to seeing where our next after show goes. I'm quite liking the spontaneity of them, because in that sense we haven't really planned any of them so far, have we? We just talk, and and then out comes this stuff. Anyway, more waffle. Until next time, take care. Bye.
Bye.